January 1951. Rochester, New York. Snow is falling on one of the richest companies on Earth, and inside its headquarters, the radiation detectors are going haywire. The readings are 25 times higher than normal. Something radioactive is falling out of the sky, 1,600 miles from the nearest official explanation. Most companies would panic. This company doesn't, because this company has seen this before. And this company knows something that almost nobody else in America knows. Not the newspapers, not the public. A secret so sensitive that when this company threatened to expose it, the United States government came to the negotiating table and cut a deal. That's how powerful this company was. Its film captured your grandparents' wedding. It captured the first footsteps on the moon. At its peak, it sold 90% of the film and 85% of the cameras in America, and its name literally became the English word for a perfect memory. It employed more people than some countries' armies, and it was so scientifically advanced that it caught the US military hiding the atomic bomb. And then it went bankrupt. Not because it missed the future. That's the version of this story you've probably heard, and that version is wrong. The truth is much stranger. This company didn't miss the future, it built the future, in its own lab, decades before anyone else. Then it commissioned a study that predicted, almost to the year, exactly how that invention would destroy it. It wrote the most accurate prophecy of corporate death in business history. And then it spent the next 30 years trying to make sure the prophecy never came true. This is the story of Kodak, the company that invented the thing that killed it. To understand how Kodak died, you first have to understand what Kodak actually was. And to understand that, you have to go back to a bank clerk sitting at his mother's kitchen table in the 1870s. His name was George Eastman, and he had a problem that sounds ridiculous today. He wanted to take photographs on vacation. In the 1870s, that was less like packing a camera and more like packing a laboratory. The camera itself was the size of a microwave. You needed a heavy tripod, glass plates, a tent that doubled as a portable darkroom, and a chest of chemicals. Plus the expertise to actually use all of it without poisoning yourself. Photography wasn't a hobby, it was a profession, and a miserable one. So Eastman did what a certain kind of person always does when the world tells them something is complicated. He refused to believe it. Night after night, after his shifts at the bank, he sat at his mother's kitchen table, experimenting with photographic emulsions, trying to make the whole process simpler, lighter, cheaper. It took him years, but by 1888, he had something nobody else had, a small box camera, loaded with a roll of flexible film. And he gave it a name that meant absolutely nothing. Kodak. It's not a founder's surname, it's not a Greek root or a clever acronym. Eastman invented the word from scratch. He liked short words. He liked words that couldn't be mispronounced in any language. And, this is genuinely the reason, he really liked the letter K. He said the word was as meaningless as a child's first babble, and that it snaps like a camera shutter in your face. He wasn't building a name with meaning, he was building a name you couldn't forget. The slogan that came with it was 7 words long, and those 7 words changed the world. You press the button, we do the rest. You take the pictures, send the whole camera back to Kodak, and they develop everything, and mail you your memories. In the late 1800s, that must have sounded like witchcraft. Then in 1900, Eastman made his masterstroke. He released a camera called the Brownie and priced it at $1. $1. Cheap enough for a child's birthday present. It sold 15,000 units in the first year and around 10 million within 5. In a single generation, photography went from an expert's dark art to something every family on Earth simply did. Birthdays, weddings, holidays, babies. Kodak wasn't selling a gadget. It was selling the ability to keep a moment forever. It was selling memory itself. But here's the thing, and this is the detail that decides everything that comes later. Kodak was never really a camera company. The cameras were almost a decoy. The real business was what went inside them. Every camera Kodak sold created a customer who had to keep buying film, keep paying for processing, keep buying photo paper. Forever. Sell the razor cheap and sell the blades for the rest of the customer's life. And these were not ordinary blades. Kodak's film carried profit margins of around 80%. Decades later, one Kodak executive would tell the Wall Street Journal something that should be carved above the entrance of every business school on the planet. It is hard to find anything legal that is as profitable as selling film. Remember that sentence, because that sentence is the murder weapon in this story. Eastman himself didn't live to see any of what was coming. By 1932, he was in his late 70s, wealthy beyond imagination, and suffering from a degenerative spinal condition that was slowly taking his independence. The same condition he'd watched confine his mother to a wheelchair in her final years. On the 14th of March that year, he gathered witnesses at his home, calmly signed the final version of his will, and after they left the room, he ended his own life. The note he left behind was 14 words long. To my friends, my work is done. Why wait? The founder got to choose how his story ended. His company would not be so lucky. By the middle of the 20th century, Kodak wasn't a big company. It was closer to a fact of nature. In 1976, it controlled roughly 90% of film sales in the United States and 85% of camera sales. Think about what those numbers actually mean. For every 10 photographs taken in America, 9 of them existed because Kodak made them possible, and Kodak got paid at every step. When Neil Armstrong stood on the moon, the pictures came back on Kodak film. Paul Simon wrote a top 10 hit that was literally named after their product, Kodachrome, and the company's marketing slipped so deep into the culture that a Kodak moment became the standard English phrase for any memory too precious to lose. No brand in history had ever fused itself so completely with something so human. The company's hometown of Rochester, New York, became a company town in the fullest sense. At its height, Kodak employed around 60,000 people in Rochester alone, and well over 100,000 worldwide. It paid for hospitals, theaters, universities. If you lived in Rochester, Kodak wasn't your employer. It was your economy. And its scientific power went far beyond photographs. Here's the part of the story almost nobody tells, the part that shows you just how far this company's reach extended. In the summer of 1945, Kodak started getting angry letters. Customers were complaining that their X-ray film, Kodak's most sensitive product, was arriving ruined, covered in mysterious black spots, fogged before it was ever used. This should have been impossible. Kodak was so paranoid about radioactive contamination that it controlled its own packaging supply chain, right down to the mills that made the cardboard. So, a physicist at Kodak named Julian Webb, a man who, conveniently, had worked on the Manhattan Project, started investigating. He traced the contamination to strawboard packaging from a mill in Vincennes, Indiana, specifically to a batch manufactured on the 6th of August 1945. By eerie coincidence, the exact day Hiroshima was bombed, and when he analyzed the radiation, it didn't match radium, or anything natural, or anything a factory could produce. The contamination had come out of the sky. It was carried by wind and rain into the river water the mill used, and its signature pointed to one conclusion. Somewhere inside the United States, someone had detonated an atomic bomb. The public didn't know that. Officially, the flash in the New Mexico desert on July 16, 1945, the Trinity test, the first nuclear explosion in human history, had been explained away as an ammunition dump accident, the greatest secret in the world. And a film company in upstate New York had figured it out, from ruined cardboard. Webb understood exactly how dangerous his discovery was. He sat on it for 4 years before quietly publishing. But the story gets darker. In January 1951, the government began testing nuclear weapons at a new site in Nevada. Within days, Kodak's instruments in Rochester, 1,600 miles away, detected radiation in falling snow at 25 times normal levels. Kodak complained to the Atomic Energy Commission and was brushed off. So Kodak did something almost no American company would have dared to do at the height of the Cold War. It threatened to sue the United States government over nuclear fallout. And the government blinked. The Atomic Energy Commission cut a deal, not just with Kodak, but with the whole photographic film industry. Going forward, the industry would receive advance warning of nuclear tests, along with weather patterns and maps forecasting where the fallout would land, so they could protect their film. Read that again. The maps existed, the forecasts existed, they were handed to film manufacturers. They were never given to the American public, not to the farmers, not to the families living downwind. Tens of thousands of whom, according to later government research, would develop thyroid cancer, linked to that very fallout. Decades later, a United States senator would stand up in a congressional hearing and spell it out. The government warned the photographic industry and provided maps of the contamination, while ordinary citizens were told nothing. That was Kodak in the 1950s, a company so scientifically advanced it could detect state secrets in the snow, and so commercially important that Washington protected its film more carefully than its own citizens. Which is exactly why what happens next is one of the strangest tragedies in business history. Because a company with that kind of scientific firepower doesn't get blindsided by new technology. And Kodak wasn't blindsided. What killed Kodak was built inside Kodak, by one of its own. December 1975. A 24-year-old Kodak engineer named Steve Sasson has been tinkering in a lab with a piece of experimental electronics called a CCD sensor, some circuit boards, a lens scavenged from a movie camera, and a cassette recorder. What he assembles from these parts weighs 8 pounds, is roughly the size of a toaster, and is, by any modern standard, almost comically bad. It captures images at 1/100th of a megapixel, a grid of 100 by 100 pixels, in black and white. It takes 23 seconds just to record a single image onto cassette tape. It is also the first digital camera ever built. No film, no chemicals, no processing, just electronics and a screen. In an 8-pound box, this 24-year-old is holding the next 50 years of human photography, the ancestor of every digital camera, every smartphone photo, every image you have ever posted online. Sasson demonstrated it for Kodak's executives, and years later, he summed up their reaction in one devastating line. It was filmless photography. So in his words, management's response was, "That's cute, but don't tell anyone about it." Now, to be fair to those executives, and this matters because the cartoon version of this story misses the point, they weren't entirely wrong in that moment. In 1975, this thing was a laboratory curiosity. Blurry, slow, heavy, with nowhere to even display the pictures conveniently. Dismissing a bad prototype is forgivable. Companies do it all the time and survive. What happened 6 years later is not forgivable. Because in 1981, Sony announced an electronic camera of its own, and one of Kodak's biggest retail partners nervously asked a question, "Should we be worried about this?" So Kodak did what a rich, rigorous, scientific company does. It ordered a full internal study. The head of market intelligence, a man named Vince Baraba, with the CEO's personal backing, spent months analyzing the technology curves, how fast sensors were improving, how fast costs were falling, how consumers would adopt digital versus film. The study came back with 2 findings. The bad news: digital photography was real, it was coming, and it had the potential to replace Kodak's entire film business. The good news: it would take time. Kodak had roughly 10 years to prepare for the transition. Stop and appreciate how extraordinary this is. In 1981, Kodak possessed a document that predicted its own death. Accurately. It knew the murder weapon because it had invented the murder weapon. It knew the approximate date. It had a 10-year head start, a mountain of cash, the best imaging scientists on the planet, and the most trusted photography brand in human history. No company facing disruption has ever been dealt a better hand, and Kodak's own labs kept proving the study right, on schedule. In 1986, Kodak researchers built the world's first megapixel sensor, hitting one of the exact technological milestones Baraba's study had flagged as a tipping point. So Kodak knew. The clock was ticking, and Kodak could hear every tick. What did it do with those 10 years? That's the real story here, because what Kodak did with its decade of warning is the most expensive act of self-deception in the history of business. Here's what you have to understand about Kodak in the 1980s. The film business wasn't just profitable, it was a machine that printed money at a rate that made every alternative look insulting. 80% margins, a customer base of the entire human race. Every wedding, every birthday, every vacation on Earth, paying Kodak 3 separate times: for the film, for the processing, for the paper. Now imagine you're a Kodak executive. Your bonus is tied to this machine. Your shareholders' dividends flow from this machine. 60,000 jobs in your hometown depend on this machine. And on your desk sits a study, telling you that the machine has 10 years to live, and that your replacement business will earn margins so thin they'd be a rounding error on a roll of film. Every rational instinct in the building, every incentive, every career, every quarterly target screams the same thing: protect the machine. So that's what they did. Instead of using digital to replace film, Kodak spent its precious decade using digital technology to defend film. And there is no better monument to this thinking than a product Kodak launched in 1996, the Advantix Preview camera. Kodak spent over $500 million developing it. It was, at its heart, a digital camera. It had a sensor, it had a screen. You could preview the photo you'd just taken, but it still shot on film. The digital screen existed for one purpose: to help you decide how many film prints to order. Kodak took the technology that was destined to destroy film and spent $500 million turning it into an accessory for selling more film. It flopped, of course. It deserves a museum wing of its own. And 1996, the year of that launch, was also the year Kodak hit its all-time peak. Around $16 billion in revenue, a market value around $30 billion, one of the 5 most valuable brands on Earth. From the outside, it looked invincible. Inside, the 10-year window had already closed. Now here's where this story breaks from the lazy version you've heard. And honestly, the truth is more painful than the myth. The myth says Kodak ignored digital until it was too late. It didn't. Kodak eventually charged into digital photography with everything it had. Through the 90s, it sold some of the first consumer digital cameras. In 2001, it launched the EasyShare line. Genuinely good, genuinely easy digital cameras. And by 2005, Kodak had fought its way to become the #1 seller of digital cameras in the United States of America. It beat Sony, it beat Canon on its home turf. Digital sales surged 40% in a year, to nearly $6 billion. That year, for the first time, Kodak earned more from digital than from film. Kodak won the digital camera war, and in that same victorious year, the company lost more than $1 billion. Because here was the trap that had been waiting inside this story since George Eastman priced the brownie at $1. Kodak's empire was never built on cameras. It was built on the blades, the film, the processing, the paper, the endless aftermarket. A digital camera has no aftermarket. You sell it once, at a razor-thin margin, against ferocious Japanese competition, and then the customer never needs you again. There is no digital film. Every EasyShare camera Kodak sold didn't just earn a sliver of profit, it actively destroyed a future stream of film revenue. Kodak was winning a pie-eating contest where the prize was more pie. The better it did at digital, the faster its real business died. And then came the punchline the universe had apparently been saving. Just as Kodak finally, painfully, completed its transformation into a digital camera company, the digital camera itself died. In 2007, Apple released the iPhone, and within a few years, standalone digital cameras were being annihilated by the phones in everyone's pockets. The disruptors got disrupted. Kodak had spent 30 years too afraid to jump from one melting iceberg, finally jumped, and landed on another iceberg, melting even faster. After that, it was arithmetic. Kodak's cash pile shrank from $1.6 billion in early 2001 to under $1 billion by mid-2011. The dividends stopped. The layoffs came in waves, and Rochester hollowed out. Tens of thousands of jobs gone. And on January the 19th, 2012, Eastman Kodak, 131 years old, the company that taught humanity to photograph itself, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, with $6.75 billion in liabilities. Even the funeral had one final humiliation. Kodak's last great treasure was its patents, over 1,000 digital imaging patents. The paperwork proving it really had invented this future. Kodak told the bankruptcy court they could be worth more than $2 billion. Outside experts had floated numbers far higher. When the auction ended, the entire deal fetched $527 million, and the core patent portfolio itself accounted for only a fraction of that. The company that invented digital photography couldn't even sell the receipts for a tenth of what it thought they were worth. And if you want to know whether this ending was inevitable, whether any film company could have survived, you only have to look across the Pacific. Fujifilm, Kodak's lifelong rival, faced the exact same meteor at the exact same time. But where Kodak's leadership asked, "How do we protect what we have?" Fujifilm's chief executive, Shigetaka Komori, asked a completely different question. What are we actually good at? And where else could that be valuable? Fujifilm had spent 80 years mastering gelatin and preventing photographs from oxidizing and fading. Skin, it turns out, ages by similar chemistry. So Fujifilm launched a skincare and cosmetics line, Astalift, and it became a hit. Its decades of X-ray film expertise became a medical imaging business. Its coating technology went into LCD screens. Today, photographic film is less than 1% of Fujifilm's revenue, and the company is worth roughly what Kodak was worth at its 1996 peak. Same industry, same meteor. One company asked how to save the product, the other asked how to save the company. Only one of them is still whole. So what actually killed Kodak? Not blindness. They saw the future more clearly than anyone on Earth. They built it in 1975 and forecast it in 1981. Not stupidity. Their scientists could detect a secret atomic bomb from ruined cardboard. Not even slowness in the end. They fought their way to #1 in digital cameras. What killed Kodak was something much more human and much more frightening, because it lives inside every successful company and every successful person. They could not walk away from what was working. 80% margins are not just a business model, they're a gravitational field. Every bonus, every dividend, every job in Rochester, every quarterly report pulled in the same direction, toward one more year of the golden goose. Kodak's 10-year warning didn't fail because nobody read it. It failed because acting on it would have meant volunteering for pain now to avoid death later. And almost no organization in history has ever managed to do that. Knowing the future, it turns out, is not the same as being able to give up the present. Steve Sasson, the 24-year-old with the 8-pound toaster, stayed at Kodak his whole career and retired in 2009. That same year, the President of the United States hung the National Medal of Technology around his neck. For the invention, his bosses once told him to keep quiet. His original 1975 prototype now sits in the Smithsonian, a national treasure built by a company that begged him not to mention it. And Kodak? Here's the twist nobody saw coming. The shrunken company that crawled out of bankruptcy spent a decade lurching between reinventions, commercial printing, a bizarre detour into pharmaceuticals, even its own cryptocurrency at one point. And as recently as last year, it was publishing warnings that raised real doubts about its survival. And then, the strangest force in this entire story showed up to save it: nostalgia. A generation that grew up with infinite, weightless, disposable phone photos fell in love with the one thing Kodak still knew how to make: real film. Analog photography came roaring back with Gen Z. Demand ran so hot that in late 2025, Kodak relaunched its classic consumer film lines and started selling directly to photographers again, with its professional films following this year. And in the most poetic detail of all, Fujifilm, the rival that famously escaped film to survive, now pays Kodak to manufacture some of its film. The company that died because film died is alive today, because film refused to. Because in the end, George Eastman never really sold cameras, and he never really sold film. He sold the feeling of holding a moment in your hands. Kodak the corporation forgot that. It bet everything on the container instead of the feeling and paid for it with bankruptcy. But the feeling itself never went anywhere. It just waited patiently for the company to nearly die, and then came back for it. Kodak's tragedy is that it saw the meteor coming for 30 years and couldn't move, but at least Kodak had to invent its killer from scratch. The next company on this channel had it even worse. They didn't just see the future coming, they were holding it in their own hands, in a secret lab, years before the iPhone existed. They built a touchscreen internet phone while their rivals were still selling plastic keypads. And then, they put it in a drawer. At their peak, they sold half the phones on planet Earth. Within a decade, they sold none. That's the story of Nokia, the king of phones that vanished. It's coming next, and trust me, if you thought Kodak's mistake was painful, you haven't seen anything yet. Subscribe so you don't miss it.